On behalf of RIKK, Institute for Gender Equality and Difference, and the Gender Equality Studies and Training Program at the University of Iceland, I would like to welcome you all to the second talk of the 2021 Spring Term Conversation series. Me Too Thinking Ahead is the topic of the series, which focuses on Me Too and the gains the movement has made, as well as the challenges that remain in the fight against harassment, discrimination, and violence. My name is Irma Erlingsdóttir, and I am a project manager at RIKK. The series builds upon two recent books. Firstly, an Icelandic issue of Fléttur, RIKK's book series, and this is the fifth book in the series, and it's edited by myself, Kristín Pálsdóttir, and Þorgerður H. Þorvaldsdóttir. And secondly, the Routledge Handbook of the Politics of the Me Too movement, which is edited by Irma Erlingsdóttir, Director of RIKK and GEST, and Giti Chandra, Research Specialist at GEST. And Giti will be moderating the discussion here today. So today we bring together two scholars of critical studies on men and masculinities, Tonya Haynes and Jeff Hearn. Tonya Haynes is lecturer, interim head, and coordinator of graduate programs at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit at the University of the West Indies. And Jeff Hearn is, among other designations, a senior professor of gender studies at Örebro University. And today's session is titled Absence, Presences, Memes and Masculinity. And the conversation will cover some of the implications of the Me Too movement and discussions around it for men and what their social media presence signifies. And before I hand the floor over to Jeff, let me just remind you or tell you that you can send in your questions to Tonya Haynes and Jeff Hearn in the discussion in the chat here on Zoom, or as a comment on Facebook if you're watching on Facebook Live. So Jeff, over to you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, it's all working.
Can you see me at all or not?
Yes, we see you.
Okay, okay, fine. Okay, well, thank you, Ellen. Thanks for the introduction, very kindly, and a big thanks for the invitation to talk. And I always feel like saying it's always good to link up with Iceland. I've had many really good experiences of being in Iceland. And I'm going to talk about, well, in 7 minutes, I've been told to talk about some of the implications for men and masculinities. Aha, okay, there I am. Hello. But actually, one thing I'm going to say before mentioning that is that literally this morning, for some reason, I just thought about what happened in 1974 when I had got my first job at the University of Bradford. And what I'm going to mention is that in that year, the previous year in Bradford University, they created the first Department of Peace Studies in a British university. And I think it just came to my mind. I hadn't thought about this for a long time. Anyway, I'll come back to that at the end. Anyway, to say some obvious things first, I mean, Me Too is primarily, as I see it, about women in their diversity speaking out against violence, basically. Sexual violence, gender-based violence, and other related oppressions and discriminations of various kinds. It's also obviously linked with other kinds of campaigns online in terms of same-sex violence and violence also against LGBTIQA+ people. So I think one has to think about this in a kind of rather, what I've called variegated way in the chapter I did for the handbook. And of course, at the present time of COVID, this has become particularly intense. Without repeating numbers or figures, I think everyone knows there's been a large increase in violence against women over the pandemic, I think. But of course, in a very, very obvious and a very profound sense, Me Too is caused by men and the actions of men. And not only those who do violence, if you like, directly, but also those who actually men who support that, if you like to say, less directly or more passively. So, I mean, this is the term absent presence, which Ellen mentioned in the title, what I'm trying to refer to, that men, or some men, are a kind of absent presence. They're behind the formation of violence and why Me Too happens, but they're obviously generally absent from the speaking out, although of course they produced that speaking out from women. So men are kind of like an absent cause of Me Too, who then in turn become what is spoken about. They are the object, or we are the object of talk, of writing online, of testimony, of accusations, allegations, and action, and so on. And those allegations sometimes are anonymized, and sometimes they're naming specific men. Obviously, sometimes celebrity men. There's been obviously many high-profile cases, you might say, of this. Sometimes they're more collective statements about men, you could say, in general, or certain groups of men, say, who are maybe best friends in inverted commas, but then actually do violation, or men who are partners, or men who've met one night and that's it. So one of the obvious impacts of Me Too, I think, is to refocus or to rename, if you like, activism around the naming of men, or some men, as abusers, perpetrators, and violators of violence. I mean, that's perhaps again is saying the obvious. And sometimes there's a response from individual men, often not. There's obviously also other kinds of responses that are more institutional, other kinds of interventions. I mean, there are obviously anti-violence programs and campaigns, even though the actual success of some of those interventions, like men's programs, are not always what one would hope for. But then there's this sort of other circle of what one might call homosocial networks of men who may be very important in either supporting or sometimes opposing violence, not necessarily doing direct violence one-to-one, but actually are important in terms of behaving in a way that might be labeled conventionally as non-violent, but actually may maintain violence indirectly, and who actually may even separate themselves or ourselves very strictly from being different from those other men, inverted commas. But they can still actually be involved in creating what you might call collusive environment for violence, or even the condoning of violence as, you say, friends or neighbors. So anti-violence action or prevention and intervention, crucially, I think, has to also involve men who are not necessarily doing the direct violence at that point in time. And this has been made clear, I think, from various discussions, I think, in many parts of the world. It's not just, if you like, a particular minority. This also raises some other very complicated issues, I think, in terms of what you might call victimhood or survivorhood for some men and boys, because it's clear that some men and boys do experience themselves as victims or survivors of violence. But that also may sometimes be actually a subject to denial, or something that only actually is dealt with many years later, sometimes decades later, say from abuse as a boy. And then, of course, in a different way, men who have been accused, alleged, or even convicted of violence may, of course, continue to deny that violence as a different kind of denial. So the issue of denial, both of vulnerability and denial also of actually perpetration of violence, I think is an important aspect that Me Too, indirectly at least, raises up. So Me Too is, if you like, women's creation. Women of different kinds, different diversities, but there's an absent presence, to repeat, and men's relation to that can be rather ambiguous. But I this might, I hope I explain this as well as I can. I don't think men need to actually embroider Me Too. It stands in itself, in its own terms. That's what I want to say. I mean, men need to change, but don't necessarily have to just produce statements which then solve the problem. But Me Too is definitely a challenge for individual men. It's a challenge for what you might call friends and neighbors, for family members, for relatives. Also, crucially, I think, for institutions, workplaces, universities, factories, offices. And of course, it's also a challenge for social movements. And it also, I think, raises the question of what I would call memory and forgetting actually, or remembering, re-understanding what's happened in the past, sometimes something that may have been done 20 years ago, which might have been thought of as normal sex, but actually now is thought of as, say, coercive or pressurized sex. But I'm a bit careful about, say, arguing that men should immediately organize as a sort of vanguardist statement and simple reaction to Me Too. I think there's more of a need for a much longer term commitment of responsibility against violence and changing ourselves in different ways. And that raises questions of, this is part of the ambiguity, how on the one hand, there's not a question of distancing oneself from violence, even if one tries to be non-violent, but at the same time, perhaps de-identifying with men in some ways, or with the dominant way of being men. So Me Too is a great opportunity, it sounds terrible to say this, for men to learn actually and change. And now I don't know how my time's going, but I guess it's near my 7 minutes. But the last thing I wanted to come back to was around peace studies, actually, what I raised at the very beginning, which is that being against violence is a really good idea, to say the most obvious thing. But that's not really enough. I think one has to think much more positively in terms of men and masculinity around the promotion of what you might call non-authoritarian, non-autocratic, non-dictatorial, simply peaceful, democratic ways of doing things, whether it's everyday actions, whether it's leadership even. I think peaceful pro-feminist leadership is an important thing. And this applies to all spheres of life, including, I mean, and I'll end at this point, including very crucially in universities, which many of us are engaged with or attached to. I think universities need to change to make that kind of positive peace, you might say, way of acting and leading normal. Thank you for listening. It's very funny to talk at this screen in this way without knowing. Or not knowing you on the screen, but thanks very much. Thank you. Back to you, Ellen, or Giti, maybe. Yeah, sorry.
Giti, I'm just going to moderate this session. Thank you so much.
Sorry.
I think that you made a bunch of points which I know that listeners and the rest of us will want to come back to later. For everyone tuning in, if you would like to ask questions, just put them into the chat, either the Zoom chat or the Facebook chat. And we will post them to Jeff later. So Tonya, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much. And first, good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to my colleagues who are here. I really want to thank the organizers for the kind invitation to participate in these critical conversations. And of course, congratulations to the editors of the 2 publications, which are the focus of this series. What I want to share with you briefly is from some ongoing research on what I'm calling red woman memes. I have a little visual so that you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. So I will attempt to, okay, perfect. I'm getting some assistance there with the screen share. Thank you so much. And these are memes created and circulated by Caribbean men in which this figure of the red woman is constant. And these memes are highly citational and an archive of Caribbean men's thought on gender and sexuality. So first, a little explanation of just what I mean by this figure of the red woman. Patricia Muhammad's foundational essay entitled, But Most of All, Me Love Me Brown Men, which is citing a 1990s, very popular 1990s dancehall song by Buju Banton. The emergence in 18th and 19th century Jamaica of the mulatto woman as the desired locates present-day desire for mixed race or light-skinned Black women to race gender hierarchies which are consolidated in the 18th and 19th centuries, which polarize the Victorian purity of the white woman and racist reductionisms of Black women's sexuality as excessive and feminine. Omiseke Natasha Tinsley posits that mixed race women emerge as exceptional specimens who would become dark versions of women, that is, legitimate objects of white heterosexual male desire in colonial Caribbean contexts where white women are few and Black women are rendered as masculine and bestial. And I quote from Tinsley again, some females of African descent could be humanized and so feminized by relationships with white men. Historians Kit Candlin and Cassandra Pybus note that being free, colored, and lighter skinned than most people of African descent, such women were designated, in print at least, always as objects. Sexualized free women of color were, by the late 18th century, ubiquitous in media, from popular songs to whole novels, as objects of disdain, and positive images are hard to come by. Objectified, commented on, and criticized, their lives were often caricatured to fit a predetermined mold. And they're talking about the 18th century, but I'm going to be talking about some memes produced in the 2000s. Some things never change. So just to describe what you're seeing on screen, in the center, there is an image entitled by the artist, The Barbados Mulatto Girl. And this shows an anonymous free woman of color who is buying fruits and vegetables from enslaved vendors. The art is done by Agostino Brunayas in the 1700s. He arrived in Barbados in 1765, and I've juxtaposed that with the meme making of Caribbean men in the from around 2013 to the present. And so these memes, in these memes, red women appear as prized objects in a race-gender hierarchy rooted in anti-Black misogyny, simultaneously desirable, unfaithful, heartless, debilitating, dangerous, bewitching, malevolent, hypersexualized, mercenary, and lacking in the domestic, homemaking, and hygiene skills normatively expected of other women. The memes on the slide are only a sample, and I'm going through a large group of them. My students send them to me. They also circulate very widely in publicly accessible areas of the internet. You don't actually have to go seeking, let's say, like a subreddit where men are sort of assembling together to come across them. And as in Examinations of Online Misogyny Elsewhere, for example, by Donna Zuckerberg in her 2018 book, Misogyny Does Not Preclude Desire. So I examined Caribbean men's meme making and online practices of content creation and circulation for what they reveal and obscure about men's online performances of masculinity and Caribbeanness. And so there are really two nodes of analysis that I want to highlight, one about gender and masculinity, and the other one about being online. So through these memes, men construct and position all women as potential or actual sexual partners. So the category woman as heteropatriarchal invention, demonstrating that men actively reproduce the coloniality of gender and sexuality, and thinking about what it means for women, for the Me Too movement, for men to conceive of women either primarily or exclusively in those terms. Analyzing the memes, you see that violence against women emerges as central to men's community building and relationality with each other, and to enacting heterosexual Caribbean masculinity. So for example, in the memes, you see a normalization of violence against Venezuelan refugee women by sexualizing, objectifying, and othering of these women. And there's some excellent research by graduate students at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. Tivia Collins and Richie Daly have a recent publication in which they talk about what it means for Venezuelan women who have migrated to Trinidad because of the current crisis, what it means to be sexualized and objectified, and what that means at various points of contact with agents of the state. So in these memes, men absolve themselves of any sort of sexual or social responsibility, casting red women as irresistible. Men's own anxieties about adversarial heterosexual relationships marked by infidelity, sexual competition with other men, being emasculated or taken advantage of, especially financially by women whom they desire as romantic and sexual partners, are all evident in this kind of a language that men are using to speak with each other. And they're also all related to men's violence against women and the ways in which men talk about violence against women. And I'm thinking here of research by my colleague, Dr. Halima Deschamps, in which a lot of these sort of women's transgressions around gender are cited by men as implicated in their uses of violence. So men seek to maintain unequal relations of gender which privilege them as they simultaneously commiserate with and compete against each other. And the last point I wanted to make was around being online. And, you know, researchers have identified that for Caribbean people, representing the nation is a key part of being online and sort of representing your Caribbeanness. And I want to suggest as well that this is also part of what is happening as these memes are created, circulated, traded, commented upon, etc. So thinking then of mediated publics on the one hand, the radical potential that is offered by online organizing for things like Me Too or Ni Una Menos or Life in Leggings, Black Lives Matter. So the sort of radical potentiality of that mediated globalized public space, but also juxtaposed with the commercial, consumerist, surveillance, entertainment usages of the internet, which predominate, and how they fold into hegemonic notions of what it means to be human and into the gendered and racialized hierarchies of cyberspace. So here we see that men are participating in this globalized digital cultures of meme making. If you look at the image, you can see that some of them are sort of Caribbeanized versions of memes that circulate globally, that they have altered in some way to reflect the Caribbean theme of you know, this centering of this figure of the red woman. And so, while men may be a silent presence in Me Too, it's also vital to examine the spaces in which men talk to each other about gender and sexuality, as well as how these conversations necessarily allude to wider conversations. So for me, it's seeing the ways in which these memes are also citing larger discussions about violence against women, or citing larger contexts, for example, the migration of women from Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago because of the current political and economic crisis that they're experiencing. So seeing these as highly citational and as means by which men communicate with each other. And I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but I'm happy to stop here and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tonya. That was, yeah, just so much there to think about and look at. So I'm going to just let you and Jeff be in conversation. Just respond maybe to each other's presentations and ideas a bit before I throw the floor open to other questions. I'm sure you have a lot to say to each other, so shoot.
I can if you want to say, Tonya.
Yeah, so thanks. I just wanted to, just thank everybody who's here, but I also wanted to share that I first met Jeff in 2011 when I was still a graduate student at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barra unit of the University of the West Indies. I'm participating in the JEXAL program and Theme 9 that was around men and masculinities. So 10 years later to now be sharing this space is really a nice privilege and a nice sort of catching up. So thank you. And also thank you so much for your presentation and your thoughtful comments.
You took my words out of my mouth. Actually, I was going to say the same to you. So it's a 10-year anniversary. We're just celebrating. We're having a private party. Anyway, but I mean, Okay, shall I pick up on a few things? I mean,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, this issue, actually, I was going to talk a bit about online, like men's activity online, because it's obviously very contradictory, I think, as well, in the sense that, as you said, I think towards the end, Tonya, that online world, the cyber world or whatever, creates, well, possibilities going both directions. I mean, the so-called polarization. I mean, it creates possibilities for really strong action, and it also creates, in a positive way, but also creates the opposite. And I don't think I mentioned, but I usually give a plug in terms of the positive side to Men Engage Alliance, which I think is a really important organization of women and men and trans and non-binary, which, as I think most people know, is doing a lot of linking up across the world and doing, actually almost every other day there's an online session organized through Ubuntu, which, if anyone doesn't know about it, it's a really useful, important resource to plug into. So that's but on the other hand, you've got all these new somewhat mediated kinds of violation, which, as you know, I've been working on with colleagues, well, for more than 10 years. And that, in a sense, it seems to get worse, except I think I heard actually just literally about an hour or so ago that 40 women in Canada are trying to prosecute Pornhub. I think that's correct. I just saw that literally an hour ago. So you've got this level of online engagement, which in a sense both mirrors, but also is a bit different to the direct, if you like, physical hitting or direct sexual violence. And increasingly there's the overlap between these two worlds, the online and offline, and even the words online and offline are a bit old-fashioned. And then if you say the transnational aspect, is it, as we've discussed before, is so important. That's the way some of these activities are working. They're not just happening in one's own village or one's own city. They're happening by linking up in both very positive and very negative ways. So this resonates a lot with what you were saying resonates a lot. Yeah, I think with the reality, as well as the racialization, of course, as well, that goes with that. That's just my instant reaction, not really a question, a comment. I mean, it's just a comment and saying that I think this is a new and very, if you think back even say 30 years, although there were online activities beginning, I guess then, that was not the way it was actually. So this is a whole another level of potentially violating reality, as well as some positives as well.
Tonya, if I may interrupt for a second, there's a question that says, what is Red Women? So maybe just a line or two to explain.
I thought I did. I thought I spent most of my time trying to give that explanation. So I'm not sure.
Maybe just a line to clarify, because clearly somebody that is confused. Where
to begin. I felt like I had dedicated so much time to trying to explain, but so I'm starting with locating the emergence in the Caribbean in the 18th and 19th century of mixed race, this sort of sexualization of mixed race Black women, and seeing mixed race Black women as, desired and desirable. So this notion of the red woman that you see in all of the different memes, or even in this painting from the 1700s, the free woman of color is in the, she's in the center of the painting. The enslaved woman is actually located, like sitting and much lower than she is in the image that I showed. So this is what we're getting at. But I'm after the historians that I cite, they mention how even in the 18th century, there are all of these popular culture images produced by men at that time, everything from songs to entire novels that are about free women of color, and that offer a very reductionist rendering of them, and on many of the similar registers to what is said today. So what I was trying to do was really show that history is very much embedded in the present. But rather than thinking about, I'm going to read these memes and learn anything about women, which is what, the revisionist historians are now doing different work with these texts, but persons would actually go to these texts to understand free women of color's lives, when really and truly they are texts that probably tell you more about the person who authored them than anything that they could possibly say about women. And likewise with the memes, that is the way I approach them, looking for what it tells you, what it, but also what it obscures about thinking about ideas of gender and sexuality, and ideas about gender and sexuality that produced by men, knowledge that is circulating. And that for me is very much the point about the fact that there's no, this online, offline binary doesn't really make any sense, is also because they're very much embedded in the politics of what is happening at the particular moment. So whether that is Life in Leggings or Me Too, or women migrating to different parts of the Caribbean, that you see this, there's a citation to what is happening in people's day-to-day lives, and that it is a conversation that is taking place among men, and very much where violence against women is indexed. So that's
thank you. I guess it was just somebody was not clear out there. I don't know, Jeff, maybe you want to say something about, I was struck by your comment on collusive environments and these homosocial networks, and maybe there's something there that, you can pick up on here.
Yeah, it relates directly, I think, to what Tonya's been just talking about, saying. I think there is quite a lot of work on this that goes back, I don't know, maybe to the 1980s, I think, around, how the so-called, these words are very difficult to use precisely, the so-called direct violence, is also connected with what's going, it's not surprisingly, is what's going on in the lives of men around them. It could be, best friends, mates, workmates, it could be, family members, relatives, but there's quite a lot of work on that, sort of demonstrating the connection, that it's not just the individual violent act, but that can be supported or sometimes undermined by what's going on around. It can be a community issue or a village issue or a neighborhood issue. And that's been written about certainly in North America and in parts of Europe. And I think also what Tonya's been talking about is again in the Caribbean, is another location, which is these are all slightly different or somewhat different as well at the same time. But also, of course, then one has what you might call now I use the word online, okay, online homosociality as well going on, which didn't exist in that way in the not so distant past. And it also links to this question that, about intervention as well, which I tried to at least hint at, is that, it's obvious, it seems like a good idea to do intervention with men who are doing violence, but the success rate of doing that is not so easy or not so direct. Some, to take the example of men's programs, some are very good, but some actually don't seem to have much effect, in practice. And so this raises the sort of the broader picture of what is going on more generally in terms of, including in boyhood as well. What is going on more generally, you could say in so-called normal life, whatever that means, whether it's in schools or whether it's in workplaces or communities and so on. And it's including especially men who might see themselves as non-violent or not doing violence, and that, which could be anybody, but it could also be, say, men who hold positions of power in, companies or universities or sports clubs, I think, and so on. And so that's another big angle, which I think has been perhaps underplayed as against the more sort of direct interventions, if you like, which are more high profile and probably should still be done, but their success rate is uneven. If you look at, I know of 5 meta evaluations of men's programs, and they're not so positive actually when you look at them in the meta. picture. I mean, some are very good, but some are not so good, you know. So I think looking at this broader picture is very important, including these moves towards transnational links, you know, and towards the online, offline, and the meme issue, as Tonya's been saying.
Right. Tonya, I wonder if you would like to respond to that. Just have there been responses from other men, Caribbean men, to this, engaging in this sort of with men or with this ideology? Has there been any conversation there among men?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I did some research interviewing activist men from the Caribbean, some who identified as feminists or some who saw that their work was pro-feminist or working on issues in relation to gender. And I kind of described them as having a sort of a contradictory consciousness, so that in the one hand, there was a lot of moves to separate themselves from men who use physical or sexual violence, and to claim an identity as a man who was nonviolent and who was also good, but also at the same time some ambivalence expressed by men about being called to organize around a set of priorities that they felt were determined by women. So thinking that the ways in which they enter the conversation on gender-based violence is as perpetrators, and that then men's organizing around that means that men are organizing around a set of priorities that women have determined. So some ambivalence about being called to the table, especially in terms of thinking about conversations, policies, actions around gender that are often spaces where the women are the majority of the actors, and that when men are called to the table, it is often in relation to violence and in relation to an agenda that has already been set. And so for me, I saw in that a kind of a sort of a contradiction, in that these are men working in various spaces and interventions in different places with youth, etc., in LGBT organizations, and seeking to organize with and work with men, but also the contradictions around how they sought to position themselves relative to other men. And so therefore thinking about, and also the ways in which they position violence as ultimately a women's issue that men were called to address. And so I do agree that interventions that will have the sort of success that we expect to see, the fact that, this is a literal life or death matter for women, and for other persons whose gender and sexuality is considered transgressive, that these are literal issues of life and death that require interventions, of multiple scopes on multiple levels. So part of where things have been directed, I would say in the region now, is a lot more space for intervention programs through the courts, specifically with men who come in conflict with the law. But we have to see that is only one, really one prong, and the way in which there is an entire sort of ecology that supports this violence, including these homosocial spaces with their links on and offline, but that are also very globalized, very transnational, and how we can intervene in sort of shifting and redirecting those conversations. And I'm not sure that I have the answer to those questions, because I recognize that the meme making and sharing means a lot of different things, including expressing your Trininess or your Caribbeanness, including the relationality with other men, this being a way of discussing heterosexual relationships and men's anxieties within them. So there's really a lot that is happening simultaneously. So it's difficult to figure what might be these valuable points of intervention, because we understand that, you know, relations of gender, and including unequal relations of gender, are often foundational to how different cultures or communities define and think of themselves. And so redressing that becomes also requiring a much larger, broader systemic rethinking about, you know, who we say that we are.
Right. Gosh, thank you so much. I have just a quick question, and then we have questions coming in that I'm going to put to both of you. But just from picking up what both of you are saying, there is, you know, when you speak of the positioning of men and, you know, how violence is a women's problem, it just strikes me that these memes weaponize women's sexuality against men. So the men are the victims here, right? I was looking at those memes, you know, and the heartless woman and the man who is after the red woman and the man being led into, you know, the lakes of lava in hell. It's like the man is the victim. And so therefore, how can you bring him to the table? Because he's the one who's being victimized. He's the one against whom the violence is being done. And so it just, you know, it just struck me as really interesting, in the same way that, you know, the incel movement that's more sort of located in the US is like, we're the victims, you are denying this to us. And in this case, it's like, we're the victims, you're insisting that we have sex with you and beat you or something. I have some questions here. One of them is very specific. Berit says, would you say the representation of the red woman is also present in the Dutch Caribbean? So I guess, Tonya, that's for you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I'm going to have to say that I cannot answer whether or not this sort of representation and me making it circulating in the Dutch Caribbean. I really don't know, to be quite frank. Fair. But I do, for example, that the historical research that I'm drawing on, including Tinsley's work, is actually her analysis where she talks about how mixed race Black women emerge as desired and as these legitimate objects of male heterosexual desire, that her work is rooted in the Dutch Caribbean. But I haven't examined whether or not there's similar sort of trading and making of similar kinds of memes in the Dutch Caribbean.
Okay. So this next one, I guess, is also about positioning, but this time of women, and I'll throw it open to either of you who wants to go first. Beth Gum says, to what extent do you think that the Me Too movement may contribute to categorizing women as a vulnerable group that needs protection, as opposed to an empowered community? Mm-hmm. So whoever wants to take that first.
Do you want to take it, Tonya? No. You want to? But okay, I'll comment. I mean, it's a risky thing for me to comment on this because I'm not a woman. At least not
You're among friends, Jeff. It's okay. Moment.
But I think in passing I mentioned the word variegated when I was speaking, and it's in the title of the chapter that I did for the handbook, and it came up because when I started trying to think and write about Me Too, which was a few years ago. It seemed to me a really complicated set of different movements, across the world with different sort of faces, you might say, and different orientations and different. Some it's very much around, particular occupations. Some was more open, some more closed, and so on and so forth. So I suppose I think it's important to recognise that rather than speaking as Me Too as like one thing, I don't know if this responds very well to Beth, and hello Beth as well, nice to hear from you, question. So I think the answer to that might be very different actually in different parts of the world and different languages and different occupational groups or different, that's my initial reaction to that. I suppose I could say more, but maybe Tonya wants to add to or contradict it.
So I'll say that, I think that some of what I saw online, particularly coming out of the US, there was a way in which I felt that some of the stories seemed to conflate sexual violence with a range of other kinds of ways in which, obviously unequal relations of gender are at work, patriarchal relations of gender are at work, but to me, for me, there was a flattening of everything as sort of like an expression of or evidence of sexual violence. I think, but I do, for the Caribbean, thinking about the Life in Leggings movement, it was never something that positioned women as victims, or even thinking of the chapter by Rochelle McPhee that's in the book, talking about the Tambourine Army, that it's actually, I would say, the reverse. So it was about women and a collective, because women have always been fighting and organized around these issues of violence against women. But for example, Tambourine Army, Life in Leggings were a special particular moment in which there was a lot of momentum, and which dovetailed with a lot of momentum worldwide as well. So rather than it be a few women's organizations who were constantly doing the work, there was a sort of a widespread way in which women could also participate, could share stories, could organize, and could be politicized as well, and come as actors and to the conversation in a way to drive, to lead, and to shape it. And so you see like an explosion of organizations and movements led by very young women, you know, in their 20s, in their teens, in the region. So I don't think for a minute, looking at the ways in which Life in Leggings, or, you know, in Trinidad, they had a Leave Me Alone campaign, a range of different vernacularized responses that were very popular and widespread, and I think politicized the whole generation of women. I wouldn't see that there was any risk to sort of rendering women as victims.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent point, Tonya.
Can I just add one comment?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's just that, I mean, well, you mentioned the word generation, I think, Tonya, and I actually do think the issue of age and generation is a really important thing to, not a thing, aspect to think about, actually, because, I mean, I saw some headlines in the newspaper saying as if, you know, sexual violence or harassment have been discovered for the first time. You know, it's ridiculous, you know, and there's this loss of memory is incredible. And I think also it links to the question of different age and generation issues around men and boys, actually, because I think as well as intervention, I think intervention can happen at a very young age, you know, I mean, 5 or 6 years old, but also it concerns older men as well. I mean, it's not just about young women and young men, or young trans and young non-binary. I think this issue of age and generation deserves a lot of sort of interrogation alongside all the other things we've talked about.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think you mentioned earlier also, Jeff, that, you know, we should never forget the archiving. We should never forget the amount of work that's been done. And there is a kind of, well, forgetting or not knowing, actually, for a lot of people about what has gone before.
Yeah, in my generation, have to rediscover, inverted commas. But
yeah, which is a bit of a shame. But as I was saying, Tonya, thank you, both of you, Tonya, that was an excellent point. You know, to say that a woman who reveals or protests against being victimized is not therefore unempowered. She is in fact the more empowered. And I think also, just to add to that we are all in need of protection. This is why we have laws. Men are in need of protection, women are in need of protection. This is why, of course, we have laws and the police force and so on. I have another couple of questions, so I'm just going to go right into it because we're kind of running out of time. This one is from an audience member for Tonya, and the question is, on the red woman, I'm wondering if in Tonya's view, do we see a change in this idea of gender and sexuality in the near future? As a dark-skinned Black woman, I find that white men, she doesn't want to generalize, view darker-skinned women in a similar way as Black men view the red woman, or browning, if you will. Tonya, that's yours to go with. And then, of course, Jeff, if you want to.
Thanks for that. Thank you so much for that question. I think any sort of exoticization and sexualization of women, whether it is, you know, white women to dark-skinned Black women, or Caribbean men and red women, I think ultimately what is sort of similar, what is operating at the same time is then the way in which you are sort of reduced to object and fetish. And I think this is something that Candlin and Pybus make very clear, the ways in which how in the 18th century, across the range of media that they're examining, that mixed race, Black women, free women of color are exclusively represented as objects. And so I think that to come to the present day, to see whether it is dark-skinned Black women or mixed race Black women who are similarly objectified, I think for me, what is important is men not understanding women as either, you know, as primarily in terms of objects of their desire. And, you know, that is for me problematic for a range of different reasons, for the ways in which, for example, it heterosexualizes all public space and all women, including women with queer identities who do not want to be so interpellated in public. So for me, it's not about thinking about, you know, like which racialized woman gets to be exoticized, desired, and favored, but the ways in which ultimately these are dehumanizing, objectifying moves and ways of engaging with women.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Jeff, did you have an opinion?
I think the only thing I would add, this is so much thinking aloud in a way, I think the issue about, you know, well, racialization and skin color that you've just been talking about, I mean, often it's, in terms of actual speaking, they're not the words that are used. I mean, there are other ways of talking about these things, even in terms of nationality, or where someone comes from, in inverted commas, or so-called ethnicity, or even language or religion. I mean, that's all I'd say, you know, in the sense that to actually talk of skin color is often a good idea, I think. I mean, when one's discussing this critically, if you understand. But often there's other ways which think these issues are raised and coded a little bit more subtly, and that is sometimes equally dangerous.
Yeah, I'm gonna chuck this back at you, Tonya, just very quickly, because when you were talking about the 18th century history of the red woman, the origins of the red woman, I was thinking that the mixed race woman, even in parts of colonized Asia, was seen as a person intrinsically shameful, right? Because it was clearly an illicit mixing of the races, and the mixed race people just had, you know, they were on the margins, they were always liminal, they were never part of any community. And how that kind of dovetails and is also separate from the issue of color as, you know, a question of seduction. How the fairer you were, the more seductive you clearly were. And this was also an object of shame, but also desirability. And whether you think that ties in with this conversation.
Oh, definitely. And I think that, you know, we have to have a very, an analysis that is very nimble and also attentive to the particularities of different histories and different places. And even, I would also say, even within the Caribbean, and what some of these things mean in one location, and how the meaning, the experiences may also be slightly different, but still connected, as you are saying, in another. So for me, it is also seeing that the sort of way in which there's this sort of long shadow of colonialism, but also the way in which it continues to be constantly remade in ways that may produce sort of new and different kinds of effects.
And I feel I have to also just comment, I mean, not wanting to move the focus, but I mean, within Europe, this is also so important in terms of how, I mean, I think it's even relevant to Brexit, you know. I'm from the UK originally, you know, in the sense that it's the way in which women, particularly from Central Eastern Europe, you know, have been portrayed and in many, many different ways. And I'm thinking also of a colleague from some years ago, Dimitar Kambarov, who wrote about Bulgarians as a Black European, something like that. You know, I mean, there's some somewhat similar processes going on within Europe, which I think are highly relevant to nationalist politics across the whole of Europe, actually.
Yeah. Jeff, I'm going to put this question to you just as maybe a last one before we have some final thoughts. So you said that there were some of these initiatives of engaging men that have not worked as well as could have been hoped. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, what I was talking specifically, I'll keep it short. What I was speaking of specifically was various kinds of men's anti-violence programs. I mean, and I suppose what I want to say is that sometimes they're oversold and they cost money, they cost resources. I'm not saying they shouldn't happen, but they've sometimes been very high profile as a solution, as against other kinds of services or interventions, including supporting women in refuges and many other legal interventions and so on. But I know of 5 meta-evaluations. I mean, a lot of that's based on North American literature because that's where there's been most research in terms of and doing evaluations is very difficult because it's long-term. You can't just ask the man, you have to look at things 5 years later. It's very expensive. But the results are not as good. But all I would say is that those kinds of interventions vary. Some are very feminist and some are not. Some are very, skilled in their facilitation and some are less so. That's all. But sometimes there's been overselling. But I think there's been quite a lot of work now that says preventative work against violence, say with boys or young men, is actually probably more effective than, so to speak, after the event. I mean, putting this very simply in this context. There's some quite positive work on preventative interventions.
So it's a bit of a question mark in terms of reformative or transformative.
I think it's a whole question. It's a whole sort of, we have a session on that itself, actually. I think that the pros and cons of different kinds of interventions, like does arrest work, you know what I mean? Well, it depends what comes next, I guess, do sort of more counseling type interventions work or group sessions. I mean, it's a whole sort of area in itself, which will be very interesting to discuss actually at some point.
Maybe we will. I think that will be for content for another discussion, another time. And Eileen, I think it's time for you to jump in and close the session off. We're kind of right up against the last minute.
Thank you, Giti. And thank you very much for being with us today, Tonya and Jeff, as well as everyone in the audience. Let me full screen this. And I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to our next lecture on the 4th of March with Nicole Lee Mosby and Marai Larasi. And further information on the series can be found at the RIKK and GEST websites. So thank you all very much. And looking forward to